Well, if you turn with me to Jeremiah, I don't know how long we're going to hear that. Turn with me to Jeremiah. Won't be a long time, I think. But I've given you two handouts, one last week, another one this week. What I'm doing with these is trying to make sure that I keep ahead, because sometimes you don't know how long it's going to take you to go through a passage. Sometimes it goes quick and sometimes it doesn't. Well, I don't want to get caught without you having the notes that I'm using. So we're going to be looking at 2:14 to 19 today.
You have last week's stuff?
Hmm?
You have another one from last week?
I think I've got exactly one, Mary. No, I got more than one if anybody else needs one.
Has your name on it. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know how that got there from my computer, but it says Mary Arville, right?
Did you pass down this week?
I've got several of these from last week, so I got two more of them if anybody needs them. As I have been studying through Jeremiah, I'm not terribly far ahead of you where I've said it in detail recently, but I keep saying, well, we need to go a little faster and I need to probably skip this section. I said, no, I can't skip that. And I can't skip that. That's too important. Yes.
We forgot to say, Trina and they weren't here because their son-in-law,
Jared
knows, but he's been sick since last Tuesday, and he got a COVID test and he tested positive. So Frida, Dave, and Cindy went Saturday to be tested, and they won't know. They won't get back till this afternoon or tomorrow.
He works at the VA, is that the one?
Yeah. Jared.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but.
That's okay.
My brother and sister are coming in from Omaha this coming Friday. So please pray
For their safety and travel. I've got a sister that's coming in a week from tomorrow too, so. At any rate.
Thank you.
Jenny, I'm gonna have to withdraw that invitation.
Oh, why?
Because my sister and her family are gonna be there next weekend. I forgot about that. Yeah. Well, you can sleep out on the porch. But the mealtime, I'm sure it'd be fine if you want. All right, Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 14. We'll just go as far as we can today and see how it goes. We have been reading about how Israel has forsaken the Lord, turned away from the Lord, turned to other gods. This entire chapter continues with that same theme and with some different emphases. In this passage, we're going to see that Israel has, as part of forsaking the Lord and turning to the other gods of the nations, she also does not depend upon God for her security, her agricultural produce, and all that. She turns, especially for her national security, she turned to the Egyptians and the Assyrians at different points. In fact, sometimes against each other. And that's part of what we're going to be seeing today. We'll see that in one other place in this chapter as well, when it talks about Assyria and Egypt. But it begins with this passage. Remember, we were talking about broken cisterns last week. Well, part of the broken cisterns is depending on these other nations. And it says, verse 14 says, is Israel a servant or a slave? Is he the homeborn slave? Why is he plundered? Well, this is looking to what historically happened with Assyria conquering the northern kingdom, Egypt, Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, again, Babylon, Assyria, at war with each other at different times. Israel, Judah being caught in the middle and allying itself with each of them in turn, sometimes fighting against, sometimes fighting for each of them. The result was that Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, attacked the southern kingdom during the reign of Hezekiah, was defeated. And then there was alliances with Egypt, again with Assyria against the Babylonians later on. So it was a complicated historical process. But the point that we're looking at today, or in the passage of these verses, is the fact that Israel turned away from depending upon God for her national security to making alliances with other nations. I often hear our president, not just the current president, but past presidents, talking about our alliances with Europe and our dependence upon Europe or other countries, and letting Europe lead the way instead of being the country that has traditionally been the light on the hill. We have turned to our alliances so often rather than depending upon God. And so this is a current situation for us. I mean, application for us, that a nation that turns away from God and begins to depend upon foreign alliances rather than God is going to find itself in the same pickle that Judah found herself in these passages. Well, part of being in these alliances ended up that Israel became a target for both Egypt and Assyria, and later on Babylon. And they ended up being virtually slaves to those nations. Israel, Judah became vassal states, and they had to submit themselves and bow down to the Assyrians and the Egyptians in turn. So that's what Jeremiah is talking about. Is this the way it was supposed to be? Is this the way the nation was born? Remember when they came out of Egypt and God liberated them from the Egyptians during the time of the Exodus, Israel became a free nation, a self-ruling nation under God was the intent. But we can see in the historical books this development of a subtle sometimes and sometimes not so subtle turning away from God and turning to the other nations. For example, when in the days of Samuel, when Israel demanded a king, do you remember what they said to Samuel? We want to have a king just like all the other nations. Having God as king is not good enough. We want a physical, earthly king like all the other nations. Well, you start acting like all the other nations and you're in trouble. You're in trouble. And Israel was in trouble. She had become a plunder to them. Why is he plundered? Why is Israel plundered? Because she had turned away from God. She built her own systems, turned away from God, and now is a subject nation to these others. Verse 15, the young lions roared at him and growled. They made his land waste. His cities are burned without inhabitant. Now, to the ancient Israelites, this would have been very, very clear because the lion was the symbol of Assyria. It was the major symbol of Assyria. She saw herself among the world like a lion would see itself among virtually every other kind of animal. They were the king of we call them the king of the jungle. Well, Israel wasn't jungle and Assyria wasn't jungle, but there were lions in the mountains in those times in the Holy Land. They're not now. Of course, they're extinct there. But so the young lions, plural, would refer to Assyria and Egypt, as we will see. And they roared and growled. That's what lions do right before they pounce on their prey and kill it and eat it. They made his land waste. His cities are burned without inhabitant. I've talked to you before about the destruction that occurred when, especially during the Babylonian invasion, which is after this. But for the northern kingdom, most of the cities of the northern kingdom were also destroyed when the Assyrians invaded. And many, many cities in Judah were destroyed during the Assyrian invasion under Hezekiah. The cities were burned. They were depopulated. There was nothing left there. The people left, went other places. Verse 16, also the people of Naph and Tahpanhes have broken the crown of your head. Those two cities were major cities in Egypt. So this is referring also to an Egyptian invasion. The Egyptians weren't as nasty and mean as the Assyrians and Babylonians, but they were pretty well, when they conquered a place, they pretty well subjected it. And they were trying to subject Judah and Israel to have a barrier for those kingdoms from the north, the Assyrians and Babylonians. They've broken the crown of your head. The Assyrian, one of the prime Assyrian weapons was a war club. If you've seen some of the movies of the Indian Wars in the eastern United States, the Iroquois Confederation, a lot of those Indians used war clubs. And sometimes they had a spike in them that would penetrate the skull, but they were fond of clubs in battle. And so were the Egyptians. They also were known as archers and charioteers and that kind of thing, but the war club. So having cracked the skull is been whacked over the head really hard. Of course, in the ancient times, that was always fatal, virtually always fatal. And so the Egyptians have done their part. Verse 17, just in case Judah missed it, who is responsible for this happening to them? They are, yeah, and that's what verse 7. Have you not brought this on yourself? You can imagine, though, that false prophets, false teachers, lying kings, lying government officials would say, just like today, nothing's my fault. Everything is somebody else's fault. Never take responsibility for a misstep or a misaction. Just it's almost unheard of in modern politics. Well, that's nothing new either. But you can just imagine that that the Judean king or the prophets, they want to blame somebody else for the problems. Have you not brought this on yourself in that you have forsaken the Lord your God when he led you in the way? Well, that refers back to what we saw last week, the broken systems, turning away from God, abandoning God, following other nations' leads instead of God's lead, and it leads to disaster. And the Lord was leading them on the way. That's a neat word way to put it, because it's speaking about a path, a road. And the Lord was leading them on the way, like he led them out of Egypt along through the desert there, and led them up, and they crossed the Jordan River and went into the promised land and defeated Israel's enemies. And the Lord had been leading them along the right way, the way that he had chosen, but they refused to go that way. They refused to follow the result of what has happened. And now, why take the road? I wish it was translated it the same, because road is also way. Why take the road to Egypt, or the way to Egypt? That's not the Lord's way. Why do you go down to Egypt and make an alliance against the Assyrians? Well, in terms of politics, in terms of military commitment, you can understand it. Egypt was a world power at that time. One of the two most powerful countries in the world. The other was the Assyrians at this point. And they were right there facing off with each other. So why do you go down to Egypt? Well, militarily, you can understand it. we're a little tiny country caught in the middle. And here's this massive power from the north, the Assyrians, this massive power from the south. Here we are. So we've got to align ourselves with one of them to survive, they thought. Well, they thought that because they'd abandoned the Lord. And so it's their own fault. And now why take the road to Egypt to drink the waters of Sihor? Or why take the road to Assyria to drink the waters of the river being the Euphrates River. The Sihor is the Nile River. That I think I've got it in the notes there. That means black river. The Nile is very dark. The waters of the Nile are dark because of the silt that's coming down from southern Africa as the Nile River flows north. And especially during the flood season, when in those years before they built the Aswan Dam back in the 50s, every year the Nile would flood and all that land would be fertilized by this black soil coming down. So why did you go down to Egypt? Why do you go to Assyria? These are just questions, rhetorical questions. We know why. Because they turned away from the Lord. Any question or comment you want to make?
Is the Nile Delta continuing to have
Well, it did until they built the Aswan Dam and blocked it off. And that has created major ecological problems for Egypt because they don't get that constant fertilization of the Nile River banks and delta area that they used to get. And that's why Egypt, in the ancient world, Egypt was known as the breadbasket of the world. In Roman times, the Romans imported way over 50% of their food from Egypt because Egypt was so fertile. But it's becoming less and less so now. Yes.
Have you ever personally seen the Nile?
Huh?
Have you ever personally seen the Nile?
No, I have not.
Well, maybe that's why Nehemiah hated you, because they were dunked in that black water. I never heard that before. Nehemiah, did he have a leprosy? Was he the one? Or I thought wrong name?
That was not the Nile. That was
Jordan.
yeah, that was on the other side. But he talks about them going to the Euphrates when that event occurred when Aram or Syria had attacked Israel. Naaman was a Syrian general, so they were referring to a river in Syria that runs through Damascus. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. It was neither the Nile nor the Euphrates River. But these rivers that are being referred to here, the Sihor is the Nile, and then the river, capital R, is the Euphrates. I need to have the maps in here, I keep forgetting. But the Euphrates is north of where Naaman was. And it's the major river that runs all the way virtually from Syria in the north of Israel all the way down to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. It goes by Babylon and all that area. It goes through modern day Iraq and Kuwait down to the sea there. And it was the major river. And in this area of the world, remember, most of it's desert. We're familiar with, if we didn't have the Gunnison and the Colorado rivers running through this area, this place would look like western Utah, still, or western part of Colorado here, west from us. Desert, no water, and that part of the ancient world of what's called the Fertile Crescent, called the Fertile Crescent because it's the areas that had water, and all the way from the Nile in the south to the Euphrates in the north, the rains and mountainous areas on the coast, and it was a fertile land. But the fertility was because of the river, the water in the river. So it often refers to the Assyrians as the people of the river, the Euphrates, big river up there. So they went down to drink from those two rivers. What that means, that's talking about their alliances, and their interrelationship with them. With the Assyrians and the Egyptians.
I'm trying to figure out why the water was so important, because Israel used wells, I mean, at that time, and. they
Well,
had a river going.
Yeah, in Palestine, they were dependent on a lot of wells, but for major agricultural produce, you need a lot of water. And so that's one of the reasons why Egypt was powerful, because of its agricultural base. The Euphrates River ran all the way from what's today Syria, Iraq, Kuwait, all through that area, and provided the main food supply to maintain large populations of people. And that's why they were powerful kingdoms. They controlled the commerce on the river. They controlled the agricultural produce of the river. We're so used to having abundant food supplies that we don't realize what a military weapon food is. But it is. If you don't have it, and those nations would fight for the control of those river lands, those agricultural lands.
Well, we were supposed to go at one time to the Euphrates and drill some holes in kind of away from the river, because there was water in the ground there.
Mhm. Yeah, there would be a lot for a ways.
Yeah,
But if you look at a map, that almost the entire Saudi Arabia is desert.
yeah.
That entire area is desert. We talked about that before when I showed you on the map, how they had to come all the way up from the north and come down through Palestine to get to Egypt. So Palestine was a battleground for these major empires. Not only these empires, but other empires in the past, the Hittites, the Mitanni, the Elamites. There are countries you've never heard of, probably, that fought over that land at one time or another. The Romans wanted to control it for the same reason. The Greeks under Alexander the Great wanted to control it for the same reason. During World War II, the British controlled Palestine for the same reason. They didn't want the Germans to be able to come down through Turkey and come south and get all the oil wells and all the wealth of the Middle East.
Yeah.
So that's why they held on to Palestine and fought the Germans in North Africa to control that same land bridge. Ultimately, it's
Yeah,
just
it was only
it's just
supposed to be 150 foot deep. We had trucks that were drilled that deep.
uh-huh.
But I think it was 150 foot.
Yeah, that's not much. That's just a little well for real drillers.
I always imagine that area is just being sandy.
Yeah.
Along the Nile and the Euphrates. That's the bottom line, right?
Yes,
The fine, dark.
yes,
Clays, clay level,
yes, good soil.
absolutely.
You see that, what's his name that advertises the My Pillow? Oh, I can't think of his name. I've only seen the commercials 10,000 times.
I know.
And he advertises for his Giza dream sheets.
Yeah.
And the cotton comes from Giza, which is the Nile Delta area.
Like, what tickles me is that he acts like he's the only one that's ever used Egyptian cotton.
Oh, yeah. I'm going,
A good marketer.
Well, he is a businessman, so he's selling his product. He's not saying anybody else, but he's using it.
does anybody have a My Pillow?
Did you order?
Oh,
Okay, let's get that. Don't worry about that. Why did you take the road to Egypt? The other businesses might be asking me. Why did you go down to Egypt to use the cotton of the Giza area? Well, because in verse 19, your own wickedness will correct you. Your own backslidings will rebuke you. When they remember all that they have done in the prophets like Jeremiah, bring this to mind, and we find out that Israel was acting wicked. When you turn away from God to worshiping God, your morality, your ethics follows. It always does. You become like what you worship. You become like the one that you model yourself on. And Yahweh is a holy God, committed to living righteously, committing his people to living righteously. That was what the covenant was about. But when they turn away from God to the Baals, living righteously had nothing to do with worshiping the Baals. In fact, the Baals encouraged people to live unrighteously, especially in terms of sexual sin. And then the natural tendency of evil people is to be greedy and steal and kill and murder and want. So it doesn't take much when you turn away from the control that God had over the nation to the Baals and the Asherahs and the Moabite gods and so on. When they did that, then they were becoming wicked and evil. Now, the middle part of verse 19 is sort of a theme verse for this entire section of Jeremiah, I think. At least it summarizes it. Know therefore, and see that it is an evil and bitter thing that you have forsaken the Lord your God. It is an evil and bitter thing. Are we not experiencing that? I hear people everywhere, Christians, and even some that aren't, talking about and being very worried about the direction that the world is taking right now, particularly our own country, as we have turned away from God. Yesterday in that sermon that we heard, the preacher was talking about this issue. And what was it he said? I was trying to think. He said, we've got such, I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact words, but we've got such huge issues before us. So many difficult and hard things before us. And here we are working about which bathroom we should go in. I remember that part of it, which bathroom. That was the point that it was making. All of these major things that are affecting our lives, and we're worried about what is relatively minor.
Yeah, he wanted young men to get it, to change.
Yeah, the whole sermon was to get young men to become real men.
Yeah.
One of the illustrations he used, he's traveled all over the world. He said that in many countries, he's met men 14 years old, 15 years old, 16 years old, men who were literally giving their lives for the sake of the gospel, or whose lives were being taken because of the gospel. And yet in this country, we've got a lot of 35, 36, 40-year-old boys.
Yeah.
That was his illustration. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Certainly. It is a bitter and evil thing that you have forsaken the Lord your God. That's the theme. And then he adds to that, and this is the ground reason for forsaking the Lord, and the fear of me is not in you. The fear of Yahweh is not in them. It was at one time. But they have lived for a good while in the land. They've forgotten what it was like in Egypt. They've forgotten all the great things that the Lord has done for them. They've forgotten the conquest. They forgot the great battles that the Lord fought for Israel and Judah against the Philistines and against the Moabites and the Edomites and all the other ites. They've forgotten all that. They've forgotten that he is an awesome God and a God to be feared. The word fear is used different ways at different points. This one, I think, it always can be understood in terms of to stand in awe of God. But it might be for different reasons to stand in awe of God. You might stand in awe of God fearing his judgment, which is what is the issue here. But even when you are in a right relationship with God, you still should be in awe of God. You still should have this fear of God. Fear meaning reverence and awesomeness and recognizing the greatness and goodness and power and majesty and 1,000 words, I suppose, of God. And they don't have that anymore. And we don't have that anymore either.
The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom.
Yes. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. When I was administrator of a theological school in southern Nigeria, I always preached on that text. First, I talked about it at least during the first chapel service at the beginning of the year when we had a new class of students. I paraphrased it a little. The fear of the principal is the beginning of theological education. But the fear of God is, and I wasn't making light of that passage, but making a point really. But yes.
At what point did they forget? Was it the responsibility of the older people in the Israel group that was to train up the others? Did they fail to do that, or did it just not become important anymore?
Well,
I mean, where do you?
If you go back and look at the historical books of the Old Testament, First Kings, First Samuel, Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings, you see it's sort of a process. There were some largely faithful people, large groups of people that were faithful, but over time, especially as Israel and Judah became prosperous, powerful, the Lord delivered them from their enemies. He gave them the rains and they had good agricultural produce. Their flocks were good. They prospered. There was a time when Assyria and Babylon weren't the great powers in the north. They were there, but they weren't competing for the promised land yet. And Egypt was in a weak state. We're talking about a political explanation, but they weren't interfering with during the time of David and Solomon and some of the kings subsequently. So it appears that it was a slow slide at a lot of points. And then you get some of the kings in the northern kingdom in Israel. There in the Old Testament, there in the historical books, not one northern king of the northern kingdom, Israel, as distinguished from Judah in the south. There was not one single king of Israel which is commended for being a good king. All the good kings were in the south. David, Hezekiah, Josiah, and some of the others were not so bad. But it appears that it was a gradual sliding.
It was the leadership that failed.
Yes, we will see that. In the very next passage, we will see that.
Look at David and Solomon. I mean, it's the Lord promised, I will be with you as long as you keep my commandments.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden Solomon decided to have all these wives and to forsake the Lord's way. What happened?
Yes. And then when Solomon died, his son was even worse, Rehoboam, and the kingdom split into the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. And from there, the northern kingdom just went berserk. Judah remained somewhat faithful about 150 years longer. So there were faithful, there is always a faithful remnant. But we will see who bears responsibility in Judah here in the next section. in some of the notes that I wrote for you. So the theme verse, the summary of this entire section of Jeremiah is this, that you have forsaken the Lord your God, and the fear of me is not in you. They don't fear the Lord anymore. People laugh at us now today for fearing God. They laugh and they think it's funny. Fear God, what's God doing? What's he ever done? We'll stand by. Judah, that's what the message Jeremiah. Get ready, it's coming. As I reminded you several times already, there are 3 times, and they're not very far down the road here, where the Lord tells Jeremiah, don't even pray for this people. Judgment's coming, don't pray for them anymore. Your prayers will not be answered in the way that you want, anyway. So, that's where we're going. Any other question or comment?
I remember Bob Arco used to like to say, I'd rather believe the way I believe and be wrong than believe the way you believe, a non-believer, and be wrong.
Yeah, well, the nice thing about that is Bob wasn't wrong.
But when those towers exploded, I've noticed this, when anything bad happens, all people want God to do something, blah, blah, blah. And when it's all over, they just go back like they were.
Yeah, that's true. That we call that foxhole religion on a big scale there. Yeah. All right, next week we're going to begin with verse 20, and that will take us into the handout that I gave you today. That handout goes all the way through chapter 3, verse 5. I remember a number of weeks ago, I asked you to look at all the illustrations and the pictures, the picture language that Jeremiah was using. We're going to be seeing a lot of that next week. And we've already seen some of it, but we're going to see some more. Some really disturbing images of what Judah was like in its relationship to God. And we'll see how much we have fallen into the same traps as well. Okay, well, God bless all of you. I'm going to let you go just a minute early, which I hate to do, but I don't want to start into the next section right now. So.
Thank you, sir.
Alice and Frida. I didn't see you guys come on, but good morning to all of you. Okay, we'll go to worship now.